And I'm also using Lightroom tonight, so I use both of those in my processing. But this is really a Photoshop technique. And the one handout explains a little bit more about the blending modes, basic information about the blending modes. The blending modes are a component of the layers panel or palette in Photoshop. They're a built-in part. And you'll see I'm going to demonstrate how to use them in this presentation. So you'll see how they work with the layers. I've always been interested in doing composites and collages. The definition, by the way, comes from a book that I may talk about later, one of the sources that helped me learn about composites. But I've always been interested. I took my first Photoshop course in 2005 at Oakland Community College, and I took a couple of Photoshop courses there. And I fell in love not only with Photoshop, but I had several assignments in those courses to do composites and collages. And I just got very excited by the creative possibilities of that technique. Not just photographing, straight photography, but taking that and manipulating it in various ways. But in the years after that, after I left those courses, I took other courses here also, but I didn't really pursue composites seriously as part of my photographic practice until a couple of years ago. Excuse me, I'm getting dry. When Ann O'Hagan gave a presentation at the Ann Arbor Camera Club on using this technique. And I really want to acknowledge Ann's expertise on this subject. She really does beautiful landscapes using backgrounds and textures as composites with blending modes. And so when I saw what Ann could do with it, it kind of reinvigorated my interest in the subject. So, it's true. And so after that, in more recent times, I've talked to Ann about it. She showed me some of her techniques and some of her examples. And you've all seen her landscapes that use textures and backgrounds, and they're really quite beautiful. So I have to thank Ann for kind of pushing me to the next level in using composites. So what I plan to do in the bulk of my presentation is to start by giving you one example, and I'll show you on the computer, of a composite that I've done that's a successful one, the before and after version. And basically, if you look at the handout that talks about creating composites, etc., my basic technique is to take a subject image, and it can be anything. It can be, Ann uses landscapes. I think mainly landscapes is how you use your technique, but it could be anything. I use mainly flowers, plants, still lifes, objects, some landscapes as your basic subject, but it could be anything. So that's the basic layer, and it's what I call on this handout layer A. And then the second layer, the top layer, layer B, is, as I use the technique, is a texture, a pattern, a textile, and I'll show you examples of those so you'll see what I mean, but it's typically an abstract or a non-realistic image of some kind. So you take your subject A as a layer in Photoshop. You then add layer B, your texture or background. So you have a stack of two layers, and B is on top of A. And then you take your blending modes, and you begin to use the blending modes to merge those two layers to create something different. And I know that sounds abstract, but you'll see how it works in a minute. So what I'm going to do is show you this one example. Then I'm going to go through the technique, the steps that I've outlined, basic steps in the composite technique. I'm going to take you through each of those steps with another different set of images. And if you have questions or comments along the way, I'm not a Photoshop expert by any means, so some of you may know better ways to do what I'm going to show you. But if you have questions or comments, feel free to ask as I'm going through this. Then after I do that demonstration of the steps and the technique, I'm going to talk briefly about a specific application of the technique that's a little bit different. And then finally, depending on the time, I brought on the computer about 8 or 10 examples, different examples, landscapes, objects, and so on. And I want to very quickly show you the before and after version of those, so you can see what happens when you blend your layers together with one or more of the blending modes. Okay, let me get started here, and let's hope the computer works. So I'm going to open Photoshop, and this is the sample image. And I also have prints, by the way, of some of these. So as you're looking at them on the screen, I'll pass around. This one you may have seen at the Camera Club last year. This is a composite, and I'll just pass this around. This is the basic image that I started with. So this is subject image A. And it's a pretty straightforward image. I did some processing. By the way, I often do a lot of processing on the image before I take it into this technique. So this one I had done some work with before. So I decided I wanted to try something a little bit different with this image. So I went to my collection of patterns and backgrounds, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. And I came up with this leaf pattern. This is actually an image of a bush that I saw on my walk in my neighborhood last fall. And I took a photo of it with my little camera that I always have with me, because I thought it had potential to be a texture or a background. So I took that, and then I blended them together. And if you take a look at the layers palette, I'm going to close this and turn this and this up. So I took my subject and the pears in the basket and the leaf and blended them together. And this was the result. And the blending mode I used, here's the list of blending modes. There are 27 of them. And I'm not going through with this image, but I'll show you how they work, all of them work, in a few minutes. But I decided for this image, having done that, I wanted lighter color at 100% opacity. And I was pretty happy with this when I got this far. I like the leaves around the edge of the basket, but I didn't really like those leaves poking out of the middle of the pears. That was a little bit funkier than I intended. So in this case, what I did, and this is on the tip sheet, is one of the variations or options you can use with the technique. I went to the layer menu, and I created a layer mask on the texture layer. And then I brushed out some of the pears, some of the leaves, excuse me, on the pears, particularly this pear. I might have done a little bit more, but I didn't want to get carried away with it, so I used the brush tool at 100% opacity and brushed out a few of the leaves. And there are the brush strokes on the layer mask. Okay, so that's an example of basically how the technique can work. All right, so let me close that out. Close those. All right, what I want to do now is to do a more in-depth demonstration of the technique from the very beginning. I'm going to use a different set of images for this. And so when I start, and I'm going to Lightroom here because I have imported a number of folders, and I'm going to take an image, a different kind of image. Let's see. I just, for the purposes of this presentation, I pulled together 25, I think, images from my files of a variety of sorts, but I've already pre-selected one just because I want to save us some time here. So this is an image that I took at Greenfield Village last summer of a mill on the grounds. It's okay. It's not great. Let's see what we can do with it in using this technique. So I'm going to open it in Photoshop. So this is our subject A as the base layer. Now I'll go back to Lightroom and look for a pattern or a texture of some kind that I can use with it. And again, I pre-selected one here. This is weathered wood. I think it was part of a garage door that I photographed on my neighborhood walk. And I'm always looking for textures and patterns and graphics when we're out photographing. And in a few minutes I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I have, by this point, a fairly good-sized collection of a whole variety of kinds of graphics, patterns, textures. I just love to find those, whether it's in nature or in buildings, wood, rust. These all are terrific, very rich sources for abstract graphics. Sometimes in and of themselves. But here I'm using them, and this collection I have, I'll come back to later, will show you some of them. But right now I want to take this into Lightroom, into Photoshop. Okay, so now I have two images in Photoshop in two separate files. And what I need to do to use the composite technique with the blending modes is to bring them into one file. And the way I do that is to, let's see, let me do this first. So I have these two images, and I always bring my texture into the base image. So I do a copy, oh wait a minute, to select it. I use Control-A to select the whole thing, and then I copy it on that. I go to the other image, activate it, and paste. There are several different ways to cut and paste or copy and paste into the other image. This is, and I've tried several, this one works pretty well. The paste in place will probably take this weathered wood image and put it over the whole image from Greenfield Village. But what I do if it's like this, and I want the textured wood to cover the entire image. So I'll do an edit, transform, scale, and then simply begin to pull and stretch it to cover the whole image. And it doesn't really matter if this distorts the wood for the purpose of this technique. If it were a different kind of image, it might, but not for the purpose of this technique. Okay, now if you look at the layers palette, we now have two layers. Your subject image is on the bottom as the background, and above it is the wood, and I'm going to name it just for this exercise. And up here is the blending mode window. If I click on the arrow, you'll see all of the blending modes from top to bottom. Normal is the default, and normal doesn't do anything in this technique. It just is where you start. But the way I do this when I'm trying to find a good composite, I just go through the whole list. I start at the top and I go down and look at each version. And you'll see this. So I start here.
Pat, do you reduce the intensity or something so you can see the picture under it?
No,
Get an idea?
you don't need to. You'll see in a second. You don't need to.
Okay.
If I were doing this, doing a different kind of, if I were doing a selection to bring it into the image as a collage rather than a composite, I would reduce the opacity so I could position it. I know what you're talking about, but for this you don't, and you'll see, this is dissolve. Dissolve is useless for this technique. But it starts getting interesting. I'm going through from top to bottom, and this is the blending modes group. The darken group is one of the more useful groups for this technique. So this is darken at 100%. And I think it has some potential. But it might be too strong or too harsh. So one of the tips I have on the handout is to start to reduce the opacity. So I brought the opacity down to 72%. And I think it has some potential. This may not be what I end up with, but I kind of like the weathered effect on the building. This is the original, and here's the version as darkened wood. Now the other thing, and I'm going to continue to go through the rest of the blending modes, so you'll see what differences. But I like this well enough at this point that, again, this is on your handout sheet, I will make a snapshot of this. In the history palette, at the bottom is this little camera icon. And it allows you to create a snapshot. If I scroll up to the top, you'll see that I've created a snapshot of this version. And I will name it Darken 72%. That's the particular blending mode, and that's the opacity. So essentially, I've saved it as a screenshot when I continue to go on through. So now I'll continue to the next blending mode. I'm at darken, I go to multiply. Not much different from darken. Darken and multiply, color burn, linear burn, darker color are all blending modes within that darken group. And so they often give quite similar results. Color burn, and if you see one you like, shout it out.
Are you hitting the down arrow to change, or how are you doing that?
I'm using the the wheel
Oh,
on
okay.
my mouse.
I got you.
There are keyboard shortcuts. I have a couple of articles you can look at. They're on the resources list from the internet. which give keyboard shortcuts. I've tried to use the keyboard shortcuts and they just don't work for me with this. So even though this is sort of cumbersome, I just scroll through with my mouse, with the wheel of my mouse from one to the other. So this is color burn, linear burn, darker color. Well, that's not bad either. That's close to the first one I made a snapshot of, and I'll go back to that one so you can see. So this is darker color, and this is darkened. And they're pretty similar to each other. And again, they're in the same group. So let's go on. So that was darker color. Now we're moving into the lighten group. And that's the one called lighten. Screen, color dodge, linear dodge, lighter color, overlay. Well, that's a little bit different, Ann?
I like that one.
Okay.
I do too.
I wonder what it looks like at 100%.
All right, let me increase the opacity to 100%. What do you think?
I don't know.
Right.
Back down a little bit.
Reduce the
Yeah.
opacity?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Maybe not all the way,
Okay, that's, let me bring it down to maybe, that's 67%. So you can play around with the opacity very easily to see the differences in the effect you get on the image. And this is completely non-destructive. If you don't like it, you just dump the layer, just, or go on to the next one. Well, let's say this is a potential. So again, I'll make a snapshot of overlay, go up to, well, that one we'll get rid of, I don't know what snapshot that was. Okay. All right, this is overlay at 67%. All right, so we're about halfway through. This, as I'm demonstrating this, I realize this sounds like it's going to take a lot of time to do, but you can do this very quickly when you go through a couple of layers like this. So I'm at overlay, so the next one is soft light. I'm going to go back up to 100% opacity here. Soft light, hard light, vivid light, linear light, pin light, hard mix, difference. We're getting into some of the blending modes toward the bottom of the list get a little bit more psychedelic, or they get wilder. And this one, I guess if it were Halloween, it might work. But it's fascinating to see what kind of different effects you can get from these same two layers. So I'll go on here. Exclusion, don't think so. Subtract, divide, hue. The last group, the component group, there are four of them: hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. They tend to remove color, to desaturate the color, to give you a more toned effect, or sometimes a sepia effect. So this is hue. The next one is saturation, which actually does quite the opposite in most cases. It desaturates much of the image. Again, this is the original image, and this is the background version. So that's the blending mode. This is color, and you can see it's taken even more of the color out. This is the original. This is the color version at 100%. And the final one is luminosity, which only changes the color of the wood. Okay, those are the all of the blending modes.
What happens when you take that opacity down?
Yeah.
Okay, let's try that. That's kind of interesting,
Yeah.
because it looks like we have the original image with just some of the wood effect over it. What do you think? That's at 42%.
Yeah.
Have you tried to get rid of the band that's just below the top?
Here, that's part of the
No,
wood.
not there,
That's coming.
the other one. The one that's really solid, a solid version of brown
In
in
the
the
sky.
overlay.
In the sky?
Yeah.
You mean up there?
No,
Now, you
No,
can't
it
see
doesn't.
it.
Next straight down.
The gold.
yeah, go to the first snapshot.
The first snapshot? Okay, hold on. The darken?
Whichever-
That one? Oh, you mean this panel here?
That brown stuff there.
Yeah,
You
that's
just
part of it.
stretch, get rid of that and just stretch the rest of the overlay.
Let's see, so if I went back to this, let me, I'll have to re-import it. I know what you're talking about, Joel. Let's see. So, I'm not sure I can do it on the layer. If somebody knows how I can do it on the layer in this file, what you're suggesting, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is to stretch the wood to get rid of this portion of it?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
I'm wondering if can you crop layers individually?
I don't know. Anybody know?
well,
You could wipe it out.
you can clear areas. You define it with a marquee and then you clear the area.
And then you just stretch it again?
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
also try content fill and see what it does, that would be interesting.
I'm sorry, what, Craig?
Could try, put the marching ants around it and then try content fill and see. what-
Around this portion of it?
Yeah, around that
No,
brown
no,
portion, see
they-
what fills
It'll
in.
be three.
Okay.
But you might not be able to do it.
I don't mean to
well.
speak out here, but I know Pat has a normal presentation going on here. Joel did mention something that was interesting, but I don't want to take you too far off
Okay,
track,
all right.
because you,
Gentle
Yeah,
fill.
I see the problem, and
Brush it out.
what, one option would be staying within this technique. If I were,
We did that.
and I am bothered by this, by the way, this band of brown, which is in the original wood. What I would do, and this may not be the most efficient way to do it, would be to go back to my other file and stretch it differently,
yeah.
so that, and I can just quickly do that, but
Switch it
I
right
don't
over.
wanna hold it up here, so go back to edit. For some reason the transform isn't active here.
Select it all first, select all.
Oh, right, thank you. Right, now I can.
Yeah.
Yeah, even a little more.
Yeah, a little more.
Yeah, that's an easy way of doing that too.
Yeah, on the bottom one too.
And maybe we could even get rid of this part at the bottom.
Yeah.
So there, we've got something that's
Very good.
more uniform. Okay, so,
Thank you.
if I then do an edit, copy, and go to,
And the nice thing is that it still has the horizontal structure that goes with the house, that goes with the building.
okay, I'll get rid of this layer. rid of this layer. Then we go back to, what was it, darken or darker
Yeah,
color?
darken.
Darker color.
Darken.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Let's reduce the opacity a little bit.
Yeah, that's nice,
How's that?
nice.
It's a little bit heavy still in the sky in a slightly different way. What I might do at this point is to create a layer mask on my texture layer. So I'll go to layer, layer mask, and then I can take the brush tool and I'll maybe start at a low opacity, 46%. That might be a little bit too much. What it's doing is revealing the sky behind it in the original image. But that mutes it somewhat, I think. So, okay, so we have an image that is certainly different from the original, and I think more interesting than the original.
Absolutely.
One thing I might do in addition is maybe make this bush over here a little bit brighter. It's not a brightly colored bush to begin with, but since I'm on the layer mask and using the brush, I could increase the opacity and bring back a little bit more of the color up there. So, okay, that's essentially the technique. There are two more things I do. Not to the image itself, but again, this is in the notes. I like to make a record of the work I've done on a composite like this. So I go to the File menu, down to File Info, and when you open that portion of the File menu, there is a field called Description, and it's a free-form field where you can you can type the notes about what you've done. And I try to do that with every image where I've created a composite. So I know what blending mode I've used, if I've done other things as we've done to this image. Because next week I won't remember what I've done to the image. But if I have those notes in the File Info section,
So what does that look, can you click on File Info so we can see what that looks like?
this is Mel's computer,
Oh,
and for some bizarre reason, when I open it,
You weren't supposed to ask that.
it won't,
sorry.
I don't know why it doesn't work.
that's what you get.
Oh,
On my
okay.
computer, I get the entire File Info screen. And I don't know, I went to the preferences to try to see if I could change it on his computer, and I'm not technical enough to know why it doesn't work, but.
You probably went to the right spot, you just didn't find it yet.
So then you save that, after you type something, you
Yeah,
save
so
that?
you save the whole file after you've typed the notes.
Oh.
Because if you do it after you've saved the file and close the file, you're not going to have your notes. The snapshots, by the way, are temporary. They are not a permanent part of the file. So when you close the file, the snapshots go away, which makes it even more important, from my point of view, that you make notes about what you've done. And at that point, I save the file. I'm not going to save this one, but you save the file, and I always name it with something that identifies it as a composite. And I then put it in a folder on my system called Composites, something that recognizable to you. Okay.
Do you ever save them as non-flattened? I mean,
Oh yeah, I always save them. I'm really obsessive about that. I almost never flatten a file, and I save them as Photoshop files or as TIFF files because I want those layers. Mel brings his, if he works in Photoshop, he brings his files back to Lightroom and you lose the layers. That's my experience, maybe I'm wrong. So I never bring my file back to Lightroom from Photoshop, because I want those layers.
Doesn't a TIFF destroy the layers?
No, yeah, you can save it as a layered TIFF file. It's a huge file. It's bigger than a Photoshop file. So, that's simply my practice. Any other questions about this technique?
I have a question, I don't know if it's for you or for, and maybe somebody else in the group, but just recently, you know, you talked about the dissolve was useless. I got a picture that I really fell in love with using dissolve. However,
Yeah,
I haven't been able to get it to print, and you lose the effect when you take it back into Lightroom. So does anybody know the solution for that? Because I would really like to have that picture. But it used the dissolve blending mode.
on a background texture?
One
One thing I read,
yes,
and one of the
yes.
articles said that dissolve works if you just have your basic image and you use dissolve. Then you get a kind of stippled effect, a kind of pointillist effect.
That's what this was, but it was on the texture layer,
Yeah.
and it was really, I really liked it. But I couldn't print it, it disappears.
That's
The
it.
dissolved part of it, you know, the.
Dissolved.
Yeah, dissolved, yeah,
Dissolved.
no kidding.
Can you flatten it, then print it, and then unflatten it?
You can't
You can't
unflatten.
unflatten.
You
No.
can unflatten things, but
Flattening
the
is
question
one
whether,
way.
No,
The
no.
technique I
So-
use, instead of
to,
flattening the file, is I use merge visible, which allows you to retain the layers beneath that merge visible layer at the top of the stack. And it's still a Photoshop file with your layers in it, and you can access it at any time by deleting the merge visible layer. So you haven't lost your work. I can show you.
So I should still keep working at it, to try other things to get that dissolve effect to
Yeah.
stay.
Did you play with the not the luminosity, the opacity?
get it back.
Is that how you?
It
I
has
mean,
to
by-
be 100% on dissolve.
It has?
You
Really?
don't see anything.
While we're on the subject, I have a list of resources. I have a list of resources on one of the sheets, and there are several that I went to the internet when I got interested in this technique and really wanted to pursue it more. So I've listed a couple of the articles which you can download yourself, and the one that really got me going was this one, and I have a single copy of it if you want to look at it. Again, you can get this off the internet, and it's primarily about using multiply and screen. Multiply is a darken mode, screen is a lighten blending mode. But he has some good examples and some good tips.
What's the name of it?
It's on the handout.
Which one?
It's the first, I think, his name is Sean Dugan,
Yeah.
so.
So is that one just to demonstrate that reduce and increase the density of the picture, is that what that?
It's more than that, it's more than, I'm gonna talk about that
okay.
technique.
Oh, all right, good.
His article led me to this book called, strangely enough, Masking and Compositing, Photoshop Masking and Compositing. And this is a terrific Photoshop book.
Yeah.
If you really, do you know the book, Sue?
No.
Right?
No, no, the
Oh, we
author,
know
no,
the
she's
author.
terrific.
Okay, yeah.
She's great.
Katrin Eisman, I think is her name, and she's the primary author. Dugan and James Porto are co-authors. And it's a Photoshop book, much more than just masking and compositing. But it has 2 chapters on layers, and in one of the chapters on layers, there's a whole section on the blending modes, and I put the page numbers. It's an expensive book, but for me it's really been worth the investment. It takes Photoshop to it, and in a clear way. it's really a well-written book, so. And then there are a couple of other articles I found also on the blending modes, and those are on the list, and I have one of the copies of those, Photoshop Blend Modes Explained. Some of the stuff on blending modes on the internet is very technical, and I just can't deal with that level of technicality. So the ones I put on the list are ones that are straightforward and instructive and give you lots of examples of how it works. So let me show you one specific application of the technique, and Dubin's article goes into detail about this technique. And even if you don't want to get creative with the blending modes, I love using the blending modes to create composites because there's a strong element of surprise and serendipity in using them. And it's fun. For me, it's a lot of fun to say, okay, I take A and B, and what do I get? You don't know. You never quite know what you're going to get when you start running through those blending modes. And I like that. I like that element of surprise. And I've done images, believe me, where nothing worked, where I simply scrapped all of them because none of them looked good enough to keep. But on the other hand, like this exercise we did, there was one at least that I think is worth keeping, better than the original image. And the books will tell you this also, or the articles, that blending modes are not a cut and dried cookie cutter kind of tool. There's this large element of surprise, of what if factor in using them. The analogy that I like to use to explain the blending modes is the kaleidoscope. When I was a kid, I loved looking through a kaleidoscope. You know, turn that wheel, and every image was different, and none of them were ever the same, and I was fascinated by that. No matter how you turned it, how you shook it. Well, the same is true of the blending modes. They're always different. No two of them are ever the same. Now, some of them are similar, we saw that, but they're always different. So that to me is one of the real pleasures of using the technique. This application is a little bit more practical perhaps, and it's based upon, in the one handout I have on the basic information, item 4, the darken group and the lighten group. I'm going to, and I'll show you with 2 different types of examples how this works. And it's particularly useful if you have an image with dark pixels. Part of your image, part of your subject matter contains dark pixels like text. And this is one of the applications of it. If you have an image with text on a light background, and let me show you what I'm talking about here, like that. And it could be a sign, it could be a letter, any kind of text on a light background. You can bring this into an image, superimpose it on your image, use the multiply or one of the darken blending modes to add the text to your image fairly efficiently. You can also, of course, use the type tool in Photoshop to add type, and I've done that a lot, but this is a different application. So let me show you how it works. A couple of, Sandy, you probably recognize this sign. This,
Way too much.
this is a sign that Mel and I found when we were on the Camera Club trip to Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And our timing to go to the park was perfect because we were there the week the government was shut down. They knew we were coming, so they shut the national park down the very weekend we were there. Well, that didn't deter Mel and me from using the park, and we were on one of the trails in the park, and the other image I have is this trail particularly. And we came across, this is a trail in the park at Boston Mills, near one of the visitor centers. And there was a gate. The gate is behind me. I took this photo. The gate closing the trail was behind me. It's a wooden gate. And this sign was on the ground. Now, it had been evidently stapled or nailed to the gate, but some irate hiker had torn it down. It was on the ground. So I took it. Mel took a photo of it. I took the sign, got home and scanned it as a memento. Everything is grist for the photographic mill.
Is her getting it off?
So you now, let's get this straight, you not only trespassed, but then you
I
stole
stole
government property.
Don't tell him where.
Yeah, I won't.
So,
I wouldn't trust Greg.
all right, so now what I'm going to do to show.
I'll get some good money for this tape.
Is I'm going to start the process essentially the way I've just described it, if I can get these to float. And I'm going to put this sign on this image. This time, though, I can make a selection. I don't need to. Okay, I've made a selection, and I'll simply bring the selection into this image by copying and pasting. Okay. Doesn't do very much, does it? But this is where the blending mode comes in handy, because if I go to the multiply blending mode, and it's hard to see because the image is fairly dark, I have eliminated the white background because it's black text on a white background. That's the key. It doesn't have to be white, but it has to be light in color. And so you can take a sign, or one application, and I think in Dugan's article he talks about this. He has a piece of writing, handwriting, from I think a ship's log. And he brings it into an image of a ship in the ocean. And when it's brought in using this technique, using multiply or one of the other darkened blending modes, the background of the letter of the writing disappears, and what is left is the handwriting itself. Another application I thought of, I haven't done this, if I collect recipes, and I've done family cookbooks, and handwritten recipes from a member of your family are really important family heirlooms. You could take a recipe like that was handwritten, and if you had a photo of the person, the mother, the grandmother who wrote the recipe, you could use this technique to bring the recipe into the photo of the person whose recipe it was, or the food, or the dish. So that's another potential application of this technique. You can also, if in this case the image is too dark for the text to show up, what I discovered is if I go to the divide blending mode, it converts the text from black to white. So let me give you one more example that doesn't use text, that uses silhouettes, because that's another way you can use this technique. If you have silhouettes of people, objects. So I will, okay, this one, and so.
Those are your notes? No?
Hmm?
That file name is that long? We saw the several lines when you picked it.
No, that's just another image. Here, let me, you'll see the notes over in a minute. Okay, so this is a graphic that I pulled from the internet, and they're silhouettes of birds. And this is an image from the weekend that we took a photo workshop in Coburg, Ontario. Fritz recognizes
Oh,
it.
yes.
He was there too.
Yeah.
And that's actually Barbara Bergman
Oh,
in this
okay.
photo. This is the beach, Lake Ontario at Coburg. So and this is kind of gimmicky, but I'll show you, you can bring one or more of these birds into this photo quite easily using the same technique. So I'll go to range. So we can choose any bird we want to. So let me just make a rough selection of this bird. What is this? An eagle,
I
maybe?
think so. Looks like it was a
Yeah,
cow.
okay. A hawk, bird of prey. Here we go. A preview of Saturday's field trip, right? Okay, so I'll do an edit, copy. And there he is. But let's first eliminate that white background by going to multiply. And he's a little bit big. This isn't Alfred Hitchcock's birds, right?
You could rotate it so
We're
the
gonna do
bird.
edit
Yeah, flip
transform.
it.
Rotate it so
Flip it horizontally.
yeah, put it horizontal above the
Right.
statue.
We're gonna scale him down to, we're gonna cut him down to size. Barbara would appreciate
Barbara's
that.
He's still bigger than Barbara.
Oh, he's too small to carry her away now.
That's true. Big enough to. Okay.
He's 10 miles away.
So then you can simply move him around, and you
He
could, of
flies.
course, you could add several more of these birds to this
Okay.
photo. And what you might also do, and this is where I was having fun, Barbara would appreciate this. I can, the transform, you can have him dive bombing. There we go.
Now bigger.
Now you have to make it
Look out,
larger.
Barbara.
Now it's gonna be bigger.
All right, so that's, the basic technique takes dark pixels on a light background, and using one of the darken blending modes brings it into the image, and then you can manipulate it however you want to, but I think it has some practical applications. All right, so let me close these out. Let me talk for a minute, since I showed you that graphic of the silhouettes of birds. And these are my, let me go to, there are lots of graphics you can download off the internet. Some you have to pay for, some are free. This group here, and the one of the birds, comes from a website called graphicstock.com. And I recommend going, if you're interested in finding abstract patterns of a variety of sorts, and they have thousands of them. And I've just downloaded, I think there are 49 here. There's the one of the birds. You can get, if you're careful, and I did this, they offer a 7-day free trial where you can download up to 20 images a day for 7 days, free of charge. And I did that. I didn't download, what's 7 times 20, 140. I didn't download that many. But I downloaded about 50 or 60 over the course of a week. You have to be careful though, because they want your credit card when you subscribe at the beginning of the 7-day free trial. And they tell you that, you know, if you decide to cancel within the 7-day period, they will wipe your credit card. And they did. But you have to be careful to remember to tell them you want to cancel before the end of the 7-day period. Or it automatically, you know the routine, that's how these things work. They automatically, it's like Netflix. If you don't tell them to cancel, you're stuck for that month's subscription. But it's a very useful website. Another one is FilterForge, filterforge.com.
Filter what?
Forge.
Filterforge.com, F-O-R-G-E. And if you go to filterforge.com/download, don't just stay on the home window, go to the download section. You can get a free 30-day trial of the entire program, or they have packaged some of their most popular filters into mini packages of 7 filters each, and they're free, no charge, no risk to download, and one of them is patterns. So you can try it out, get 7 patterns, and see what you think about them from that website. And so this is simply a group of some of the patterns I've gotten from graphicstock.com. And I won't, go through all of these, but you'll see in a minute. The last thing I want to do is to show you more examples of successful composites I've created using some of these backgrounds, some of these textures, in different types of images. But they're worth exploring. I've used a number of these more than once. Some of them I've never used. But that doesn't mean I might not at some point in the future. All right, and while I'm on the subject of backgrounds, these are backgrounds that I have collected. Let's see, margins a little bit. So there's wood, there's brick, or stone. As I said, I'm always looking when I'm out photographing or inside somewhere photographing for patterns. And particularly now that I've gotten very interested in the composite technique, I have more carefully in my daily walks and when we're out photographing on trips or field trips, look for patterns. In nature, plants, stone, glass, rust, wood, etc. They're all potential textures and backgrounds and graphics. Okay, and textiles. I love textiles and abstract patterns in textiles. Paisleys, they're a very rich source of patterns and backgrounds. All right, The final thing I want to do then is to very quickly go through, or rather quickly, go through about 8 or 10 composites I've created and show you the before and after, and the texture or the pattern that I've used. And I'm going to do this in Lightroom because it's faster to do in Lightroom. So. All right. I also have prints of a number of these because I thought, I love doing prints. So even though the screen is beautiful, I love making prints. So I'm going to pass some of these around as I show them. I don't have prints of all of these. I have about 10 of these to go through quickly. And
That's great.
let's see, let me close this. There we go. All right, this is the image I started with. It's been worked on a lot. And over here in the side panel in Lightroom, under caption, you'll see the notes I put into the file info menu in Photoshop. So when you have this image in Lightroom, if you have made those notes in Photoshop, they'll show up here as a caption.
How disciplined of you.
No, it's called obsessive, not discipline. So these are my notes, and you don't read, the only thing,
Nice.
Sorry, Miss Fielder.
Yeah, I got it.
so this is the earlier version. This is not the in-camera image by any means, but this is an earlier pre-composite version. This is the composite version. And notice my notes on the right got quite a bit of and what I did with this one,
You can see it better here.
I took a texture that I found in Filter Forge in that free package of 7 patterns. And I don't know if you can actually see it, but I do have a print of it as well. It's kind of an oriental circular overlay pattern. And so I used the composite technique to bring that texture into this image, and it did 2 things. It changed the toning, and I used the darken blending mode at 48% opacity. And when it brought the texture in, it also brought it in the background, but I just wanted it in the pots. So I brushed out the texture around here.